I have four dear friends here, including the chairman of my board, Axel Weber. So thank you all for sticking around for yet another meal. I've done, it's my third lunch in a row and breakfast this morning, so I've had more meals with you than I have my family this week, but we're just about done. We're going to end with a bang today. We're going to start different than where we have in some of the other discussions. So we've started with the global macro, which is fine. We can go back to it. But I really want to talk about institutions, because all of you have worked in the public sector and you've belonged students of and experts on and participants in institutions in public sector and multilateral institutions. 75th anniversary of the Bretton Woods institutions. I went to the dinner the other night. A lot has changed since the founding of those institutions. But multilateralism, the commitment to multilateralism, seems to be on the wane. So Stephanie, are we worried? Should we be worried? Are you worried about where we're going? Could we recreate those institutions again? Could we get John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White and the other 40 sitting in New Hampshire to come up with something similar? Or would it just crumble and because we couldn't agree to even the size of the table? How do you see institutions?
I wonder if there's anyone in this room who isn't worried about the direction we're going in. But certainly on the question of the institutions, I mean, the question has been asked in different ways over the last couple of years, not in response to the, particularly in response to the trade wars, but actually in response to the general attitude of the US, shall we say, the US administration to the rest of the world. And the question is, can these institutions survive, let alone thrive, without the US as a willing and active participant who can see the big picture and not just the national interest? And I think that is clearly a question that gets asked. I certainly know, I'm sure everyone on the panel knows, senior officials in the G20 who are often sort of going into huddles at summits trying to have the kind of G20 -1 meetings, and those meetings do happen. And I think there is a kind of underground operation to keep the wheels turning and to have, when you can't do deals on a global basis, can you do a deal with willing partners that maintain some of this sort of commitment to multilateralism? But your mention of Harry Dexter White and Keynes reminds us, you know, one of the reasons these institutions worked was that they weren't entirely fair and multilateral when it came to the US. Certainly from my experience in the US Treasury, and everyone else has seen the same thing, you know, it started with a bare-knuckle fight between the US and the UK. The US won, and that was the basis on which policy was done within those institutions. And you had to, you know, if you're the US executive director of the IMF, everyone wants to know what your position is before you start the conversation. Right. So we shouldn't sort of idealize the sort of kumbaya aspect of these institutions. But clearly, they did produce, there's a public good aspect, which has been incredibly important. And of course, any of us worry, especially in the response to another global downturn, let alone financial crisis, whether the wheels would still turn, whether you still have enough of that stock of shared trust and norms to respond. We've certainly seen, and this is going back to the economics, you know, when it comes to trade, people can do their numbers about what the impact of a particular tariff is, and usually the numbers are quite small, just like the numbers were always quite small when you tried to look at the direct effects of a trade deal, because we all knew that it was the kind of dynamic consequences that would be important. I think what we have underestimated, and has been brought home by the last couple of years, is how uncertainty about the whole system can really produce investment, have confidence and investment just grinding to a halt. And that's what worries me in general. You know, if you can have that kind of effect, uncertainty around the trading rules can really do short-term damage to the supply side that we might have expected would take years to happen. How does that, what's the other side of that when you're talking about just the general way that countries deal with each other? So yeah, I'm pretty worried.
You raise a good point, and I assume we're all multilateralists, globalists, internationalists. I plead guilty to all those things. But Glenn, do we ever nostalgize what these institutions were before? I remember presidents we worked for went crazy about going to G20 or G7 meetings. I don't think Clinton or Obama was either.
I think that's probably right. I mean, I want to start off first by picking up on something Stephanie said. The risk premium now in business investment as a result of the policy uncertainty is probably large enough in the US to overwhelm the corporate tax change. So this has a very large effect. It's not the small direct effect of trade, but there's no audience of business people that doesn't focus on this, and the effect on investment and supply chains is real and pernicious. I mean, to your question, Tim, the Bretton Woods institutions are probably not what we would design today if we were to have a discussion, assuming people would even meet to have that discussion. But multilateralism and what it represents remains absolutely critical. And I would add to that not just the Bretton Woods institutions, but the World Trade Organization, the OECD, other venues for policymakers to come together, I think are still vital. Without American leadership, I'm incredibly skeptical that any of this has a future. I think it's naive to say that others will step into the breach and fulfill the promise of multilateralism without the United States. So I don't really think there is a G19 type solution. America's still the big kid on the block. And we need to get at this. And we see this everything from the problems in China trade, where a multilateral solution would have been more effective. We see this in the failure to get together on a variety of policy topics. And were we to have a significant global recession, I wonder where the coordinating mechanisms would be. So I would count myself as very worried by the failure of American leadership.
But Raghu, the Gs all came out of crises. With the G5 and G7 was a product of the long gas lines, the oil crisis of the 70s. The G20 was created by Larry and others in response to the Asia financial crisis. It was elevated to the heads of state in response to great financial crisis. Do we need a crisis to rally around or create the new G, or just give heft to the current Gs?
I think we may need one, and it's for this reason. I think I'm going to be a little naive and say, yes, we needed the United States, but if the United States doesn't come to the table, the world has to find an alternative solution. I mean, this is the house that the US built post-World War II, and it has a pole position for the United States, and that was a good thing because the United States often wasn't part of the combatants, but it was the one who ensured that there was generally peace. Mm-hmm. Now it's not only one of the combatants, but it's sort of breaking down the rules. And, you know, what's the alternative if the US doesn't come back? And most people think, oh, this is just this administration, it's going to pass. Well, there's a deeper seated issue with China, the rise of China and who's going to be dominant. And my sense is the world has to move on from the old structure to one where we don't have 20 people at the table determining anything, but we have 3 or 4 people, 3 or 4 entities, so probably China, the US, the EU, maybe Japan, who sit together and sort of, it's more adapted to a multipolar world. It may still be the case the US is dominant, but it can't be that it is privileged by the rules, because that will ensure China doesn't participate. We need something that brings China in also. So my guess is we need change, but I think you're absolutely right. It's not going to happen for 2 reasons. One, Washington is not going to give up the pole position, even if it doesn't really do what it takes until, in a sense, there's a change in attitude in Washington. And that may take a long time. It may take China to be much bigger before Washington says we do need to bring them in. And the other is, it may be that we need a full-fledged crisis in order to say the system is broken, we need to build it up again. I hope we don't go there, but we do need change.
Actually, way too pessimistic. If you were in this town 15 or 20 years ago during this week, the streets would have been full of rioters. There were tear gas. I remember, you couldn't get across town. There's massive protests going on. We don't see that anymore. Did Christine Lagarde do a fantastic job in reshaping the profile of the IMF? Why is there no more if the institutions don't work and we're worried about globalization, we're worried about all these issues, why is there no protest going on? Why?
So I think like Raghu, I firmly believe that emergence of China and the integration of China into the international Bretton Woods institutions was an absolutely needed thing to do, and we were slow, we were behind the curve, and even today, I don't think where we should be. If you were to redesign the Bretton Woods organization now, with more than half of the world's population living in Asia, it would not be US-centric. It would not be. US centricity reflected the outcome of the Second World War and how these organizations were created. Now they need to be more inclusive. And what you're seeing is when I came to the official sector, it was in the early 2000s, we had discussions around the table. I remember we had the G20 presidency in 2004. It was about creating local currency bond markets. We haven't progressed at all on that. And so many of the agenda items got delayed or washed out by the financial crisis. I think the Bretton Woods organizations, to your question about Christine, did a great job in helping overcome the financial crisis. I think we were very coordinated during the crisis because it was the interest of both the United States, Europe, and most parts of Asia to get on top of this crisis. The central banks have been very coordinated. The IMF played a very strong facilitating role. And I remember a meeting in a basement in Korea where Tim Geithner was still the Treasury Secretary, where the US was very clearly saying, we will give up part of the seats at the IMF table in order to facilitate China coming in. And many of the Europeans put their constituencies together and gave up quota to bring them in. That hasn't really progressed to a new level where it should be now. So we started in the deep crisis, we made some progress, but we didn't go the full way. Going forward, these organizations need to reinvent themselves in order to be relevant, because if really it takes another crisis, I don't think the crisis will come from the area where we're now prepared for. And those organizations need to play a new role in any next financial crisis. And if anything, the official sector, because of the bad experience on how we dealt with the last crisis, has less crisis-fighting tools now available than they did before the last crisis. The Fed has much less tools at their disposal that they can use fast without going to Capitol Hill. The same is pretty much true in Europe to a lesser extent, but it's true everywhere. And so I feel that we're not well prepared for the next crisis, and it's these international organizations that can help us get everyone aligned, and they're not in the position to do that now because they lack some legitimacy.
I'm going to ask you a comment, but let me give you a twist. Can I give you a twist on that?
Okay.
That all these institutions were designed to facilitate and were built around the idea of globalization. Globalization was good. As globalization stopped, are we deglobalizing, and does that mean it's more difficult to solve some of these challenging transnational problems?
Well, I do think that's what I was going to say. Is I think that there is a deeper challenge to these institutions and the mindset that they represent, and it's not just it's not so much globalization, although we can certainly debate whether this might end up being kind of peak globalization, because there's clearly things moving in different directions there. But the currency of these institutions, the currency for international collaboration, is what's going to make your economy grow. And by and large, that was, in the last 20, 30 years, there was a recipe for growth that was how you got people to do things. I think what scrambled the system in so many different ways in the last few years, and you see with populism, but it's not just populism, is a willingness to put the economy second, to do things that will damage the economy. We saw that in Brexit. Whatever happens with Brexit, one of the things that was always clear was you didn't vote for Brexit if you were putting the economy first. But it's not just Brexit. We've clearly got that when you think about the immigration debate here and many of the things that's animated Donald Trump. We have, by the way, on the other side, got that now in spades in the response to the climate change. And how does one have an effective decarbonisation strategy? We want to achieve economic growth as part of that. But it certainly is putting itself up there as something which is more important than economic growth. And Raghu's written about it, about many of these non-economic issues and the need to rebalance in his book. So I think that's maybe a more fundamental thing. When Axel talks about what kind of these institutions need to reinvent themselves, can they reinvent themselves in a way that's going to be able to grapple with these much broader dilemmas that actually don't put the economy at the heart of things?
I completely agree with that. One of the most penetrating questions of the financial crisis was asked by the Queen of England when she said, why did nobody see it coming? And I think asking the present Bretton Woods institutions to lead on this without knowledge of the underlying national currents that are upsetting the mix is part of the problem. I don't think we have to choose between globalization and tipping the table over, but we do have to remember that in most industrial economies, there are large segments, politically potent segments, that have not benefited nearly as handsomely from either globalization or technological change as people in this room. And until we deal with policies that affect those people's lives, we're not going to see the support for globalization come back. So it's not a matter of needing more conferences or a slightly different institution. We have to have those local concerns at heart, and I'm not sure that our elites do.
Raghu's written a new book and talks about local solutions and local problems, but are we vilifying globalization unnecessarily? The last 60 or 70 years have been some of the most profound positive changes in the human condition. And I can give you a litany of statistics. My staff gets tired of hearing me enunciate them. We had a whole session yesterday entitled, "The World is Better Than You Think." Life is better now than it's ever been. Why don't we celebrate the good? Why do we vilify globalization when it has profoundly changed the human condition?
Oh, I think it has, and I think it will be even more necessary as we see the aging of industrial country populations, because you will need more trade at that point between the young sort of emerging markets and the aging industrial countries, as well as aging emerging markets. But I think Glenn is making an important point, building on what Stephanie said, that if you have people who are not supporting globalization, and they are becoming increasingly important, we need to deal with that. And that's not collateral damage. We always dismissed it as collateral damage. Mm-hmm. But it's becoming central because they now have a political voice. And it's justified because we need globalization to benefit more people. So, thinking about these small towns in France, in East Germany, in the United States, where the biggest manufacturer has just left. And then what do you have after that? You have a collapse of social institutions, you have family breakdown, you have crime picking up, you have drugs picking up, and their ability to adapt is really very, very thin. So the question is, how do we address that issue? Because yes, we keep saying as economists it's all about adaptation, but we're not giving those communities just simply don't have the ability. How do we change that? And that's really not a problem of stimulus, it's a problem of development. We have large areas of industrial countries which are now underdeveloped by any definition of that term. So how do we create development? And unfortunately, development is much harder than we think.
I'm going to get myself in trouble again, as I said to you a couple of months ago. In the little town I grew up in, what happens? Everyone just left. They moved out of Kentucky to Texas and Georgia and the West Coast. They moved, and we're a mobile society. If you look throughout
we're
economic
actually not
history,
a mobile society.
No.
We used to be a more mobile society. The geographic concentration of pain that Raghu has talked about is relatively fixed. I used to be very skeptical of any place-based assistance, but I think that skepticism needs to be.
But what do you do about rural Kentucky? Are you if they're sitting on their front porch waiting for the manufacturing jobs to come back, they're going to be waiting a long time. They're not coming back. So what do you do for them? What do you do for them, Raghu?
So the great thing about technology is it provides its own solutions, right? So if you wanted to hope, and I see the problem you're talking about, it is a deep problem, and we don't have easy solutions. But if you wanted to hope, think about a service economy where distance doesn't matter as much, right? Wouldn't that be the answer, that you bring service jobs to those areas rather than coal mines back? Mm-hmm. But now you need people to have the skills to take advantage of those service jobs. You need them to have access to broadband to be able to take advantage of that. That means investment of a different kind. Right. But it is possible to address that problem without everybody moving to San Francisco.
Or moving back into manufacturing. Part of our title for our firm is the Horizon Intangible Economy.
If I may, we're taking a very industrial country view here, because the globalization viewed from that small town in Kentucky will look totally different than the globalization effect looked from a small town rural China. In small town rural China, they will tell you that we brought 1 billion additional workers to the global workforce. We didn't bring them to the workforce in the US. Many of that is a China event. And what's a China event in the last globalization phase is an India event in the next, and it's an Africa event in the next round. We simply lose credibility if we want to run the global governance from an industrial country perspective only. And that's where I think, the Chinese workers will not accept that they're excluded out of the global economy just because the industrial countries are putting up defenses. As a central banker, I've always been worried about inflation. The major deflationary force over the last 20, 30 years has been globalization and demography. If globalization is on the retreat, which I think it is, and if anything, we're happy to ratchet it in at the global level that we achieved now, possibly we're losing some of this. And you can see that the G7, G8, they only meet in G7 now because there's one player around the table that don't necessarily wanted all the meetings. G20, China, US, you're going to get the same. So we've probably moved to a level of global institutions that will not be what we'll see over the next 5 years. Reproducing everything that we've achieved in terms of global production with a more segmented world. If the US wants to step in and replace China, I have no problem about inflation coming back, because inflation will come back with tariffs. It will come back with having more expensive workforces produce the kinds of goods and services we've produced in the past. So I think we have to watch it that we don't become too industrial country focused when we look at globalization.
So actually, let me take that question. I'm going to come to you on the same, which is, if it's about solving these problems at the local level, we're having a national debate about national solutions which may not work. The publics have lost faith in institutions. You can see it in the polling in the US. Pick your poll, the belief in institutions have been on a 50-year decline. The one institution that seems to still work are central banks. Are we relying too much on the Fed to solve Murray, Kentucky's employment problem? And if that's the case, and the fact they can't do it, are we going to find that even central banks are going to run out of credibility?
Well, central banks have a hard time, and you see it with Mario Draghi's plea recently for fiscal policy to step up their game. We've been saying, and I've been very consistent for the last, decade, that central banks can bridge the current difficult environment, but you cannot run these policies forever and turn them into quasi-structural policies by doing cyclical policies on a very, very long-dated agenda. It won't work. Many of the central banks are running out of efficiency of the tools, and it's very clear, negative interest rates. Taking interest rates more negative will not have the same effect as reducing interest rates in positive ways. So central banks are finding the limits of their policies come closer, and they're finding the acceptance of using those tools without the general policies and fiscal policy kicking in to be more and more challenged. And that's where I think the central banks have maneuvered themselves into a difficult corner. They've also had a second problem, in my view. It's not just the expectation on the policy side and whether you are coordinated well with fiscal and structural. It's also, I think they've cornered themselves in the markets. They've become very, very dependent on market expectations going forward of their policies, and they've gotten into a lot of dependence and interactions with markets, and many central banks now seem to be more driven by market expectations that very often they generate themselves. So I think they're in a very difficult corner at the moment.
Are we setting them up for failure?
Well,
have we already?
I know you're trying to do a nice transition, but I think we don't want to we don't want to confuse kind of structural and cyclical things here.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a cyclical debate, somewhat cyclical debate, about what the toolkit is looking like in response to slowdowns, and there's a temptation, at least, that I think we're seeing to make the fiscal tools seem a bit more like monetary tools, and maybe we'll put the central banks in charge of the fiscal tools, because then it'll be more technocratic and somehow easier. And I think that's quite a dangerous road to go down. I mean, on a technical basis, you want them to be more timely, the fiscal policy, and you need to think about ways to do that. But I don't think you can, that's not the same thing as making them independent of government and political accountability. So that's one thing. But we've been talking about these structural issues in small town all over the US. I've seen the same thing in the UK. I think we have, certainly in the UK, is the classic example of Brexit, is a classic example of the end result of an excessively centralized state not delivering for large chunks of the population. And one of the things I chaired a commission on inclusive growth working with 20 cities in the UK. And I had to admit to them at the beginning that I'd always been really a deep centralizer. As an economist, I always didn't trust local government at all. It was going to be captured by local interests. I've completely changed my view. I think if you're going to try and bring together economic and social policy, bring together some of community, the communal aspects that people feel like they've lost. You may never be able to do that, but if you're going to do it anywhere, you're going to have to do it at the local level. And that's also where you have to build up trust in institutions. A lot of local politicians are hated now just as much as national ones, but you've got a base to start from. You can start to try and change the conversation.
But Glenn, this political cycle is all about centralization. It's all about more centralization. It's about nationalization of our healthcare system. So we're going in the opposite direction of what you just described.
Well, yes
that
and no. I mean,
Rutgers written about.
Maybe I'm too Hayekian. I'm not such a fan of centralization
Hayekian, good.
myself. I think we learn a lot from local experiments. But I do think we have one major branch of the American political system that is arguing for more centralization, one-size-fits-all healthcare schemes or approaches to environmental policy. Unfortunately, there isn't another side in that debate. We're not hearing an articulate point of view. To me, the local issues you referred to earlier would have in mind business leaders and, say, community colleges and other local institutions come together. That doesn't need a lot of public support, but it does need some. And I'm very worried that we don't have that.
But one of the questions here is, why didn't adjustment assistance work?
Well, my gosh, it was way too small. I mean, the only thing we have is trade adjustment assistance that came about from President Kennedy's compromises back in the day. And TAA is a very, very small program. If you lose your job structurally, why do you care whether it's the result of technological change, a global competitor, a domestic, smarter competitor? We need a labor market policy that doesn't just look at cyclical downturns like unemployment insurance does. We need to take the concept of TAA and have a much more expansive reemployment account approach to labor policy. So essentially, the argument for TAA is a bit like fiscal policy in the Depression. It really wasn't tried.
So we should have done more of it. I agree
Yes.
with that. That's a nice tee up for you and your book, The Third Pillar. So tell us about your approach to localism.
Well, I think it starts with what Stephanie said, that we have centralized a lot. And part of it is actually in the integration of markets demands, in some sense, centralization, right? We want common rules across. I mean, think of the rationale for harmonization that the European Union uses. Firms should see the same environment whichever country they go to because that reduces transaction costs. Yes, that does reduce transaction costs, but it reduces local control. And think about the cry in Brexit, it's take back control. It's basically saying we don't have control over many things. And so I think this is a rationale for maybe adopting some of what happens in Switzerland, some notion of subsidiarity. Let us not do things any higher than the level they need to be done at, because that gives people more of a sense of control. We need to balance democracy with globalization. Mm-hmm. There is a sense people want of having some control. And to some extent, I think with the IT revolution, firms can handle a lot more variety than they used to be able to handle. You can handle different taxes. You can handle even different minimum wages across areas. So let's take a look at all our structures and see how much we can push down. We go to, a lot of complaints against the local is, they're going to be corrupt, and anyway, people don't care about who their local, representative is or who their mayor is. Well, yes, but this is what economists call endogenous. If they don't have much power, they don't do very much that affects you. You don't really care who's there, and a lot of, less than able people get into those positions. On the other hand, if they are empowered positions and local people care about what they do, you can get a virtuous cycle where good people go in and you can make a change. So empowerment is part of the answer. How does that happen? That's more difficult. We have commissions which have to think about this. There have been some attempts, but we need more.
But that's a necessary, not sufficient condition. You still need resources. So what you do in resource-poor communities, that's where centralization, some retransfer of resources, right?
Yes, but it can be in the form of block grants. So for example, Austin Goolsbee and I proposed a Lincoln-Morrill-like block grant for community colleges. The intuition being the problem is not on the demand side, the free tuition argument. The problem is actually on the supply side of some of those institutions. But you would devolve things to the local level, local business people, local community colleges to do it, but with strong central support. So you don't need a one-size-fits-all.
Sorry, just so that there is also, I mean, one of the, certainly in the UK, and I think there's parallels in elsewhere, is to have a kind of tripartite structure. So it's not that you have it doesn't have to be binary that you give all local control or all central control, particularly if you want to have basic standards maintained, whether it's education or health. You can have a sort of sharing of power, but what you need to empower the local decision makers so that they can make trade-offs that can't get made at the centre. So, for example, if they want to invest more in preventative healthcare now, to try and prevent having to spend lots of money on, accident and emergency care for people down the road. You can't make that trade-off within the UK system, but Manchester has now, as a city, kind of taken on the responsibility for doing that and is sharing control over its health and its social care budget with the central government. That's just one example, but I think it is a mistake just to think of it as you either devolve or you keep the power in the centre. You have to try and be more imaginative.
Axel, some of the response to Brexit is more Europeans say we just need more Europe. So that's part of the issue. Do we need more Europe? Do we need a stronger, more vibrant Brussels? Is that the solution?
Well, so I think the whole debate about more Europe really is a different one than the one that is led in Europe at the moment. We don't have a very strong central government in Europe with a lot of national responsibilities at the European level. Fiscal is not there. The only thing that's at the European level is monetary policy if you're part of the Eurozone, and competition policy. And that's been discussed recently, whether actually a European competition policy that looks at competition of companies within Europe, say industrial European champions, is the right debate to have when we actually have a global competition between major companies in the US, China, and Europe. Should the European competition dimension of any such global companies be the real denominator of what the Commission looks at, or should it be the global footprint in global markets? I think Europe is too much focused on itself and inward looking, and some of the debates in Europe are about eliminating internal barriers. But at the same time, unfortunately, Europe is erecting external barriers and is becoming less integrated into the global markets. I think that directionally is completely the wrong way to travel, and you can see that in many dimensions. The problem of subsidiarity in Europe is a different one than, say, subsidiarity in Germany, where subsidiarity in Switzerland or Germany is a good concept if things are at the right level of government. In Europe, the discussion is we don't have actually a lot at the European level. So when it comes to aggregate cyclical policy like fiscal, there is no fiscal equivalent arm to the monetary policy. And that's a design feature. I think my suggestion is that ultimately, with more crises to come, we'll see more of a European budget emerge. The debate I hate is whether that should be deficit financed through Eurobonds or it should be financed through a tax allocation to European tasks. I always find it's better to tax allocate rather than deficit allocate, and that's where you are in Switzerland. In Switzerland, there is tax competition between the cantons. A canton that doesn't have a lot of expenditure can afford low taxes. It becomes self-invigorating because companies go to low-tax cantons. And having then corporate profits come in, they can afford to finance more, so they can free up personal income taxes, they can reduce corporate taxes. So tax competition, in my view, is something we haven't utilized a lot. And actually, if you look at the global level, Europe has not found a response to the tax cuts Trump did. Everything in Europe has changed, and if there is a debate now, it's about increasing taxes rather than reducing taxes, which directionally, again, is the wrong direction. So we shouldn't be surprised that in Europe we have a Europe debate, like in the UK now, because Europe hasn't really delivered on the benefits. It's very much inward focused, and many countries are starting to question whether the direction of travel is right. I'm not that pessimistic personally, because I think in this global environment where the US is more inward looking, where China-US conflicts are showing that Europe is somewhere in between, but nowhere on that map. If you take technology, Europe will have to discover that somehow it's got to put itself back on the map, be it technology, be it banking, where the European banks are really trailing US at the moment. So I think the pressure from the outside with China and the US is really showing Europe that there is a value added of Europe doing things together and creating a large internal market, because we're all too fragmented. The EU at the moment is basically outside goods and services. It's fragmented European financial markets. They're not grown together.
And are you optimistic that's going to happen, that we're going to have more integration, and we're going to have banking union, capital market union, we're going to
Well, basically, yes, but what Europe is doing is it's trying to focus on the internal dimension, and putting together the small European capital markets will not make a big capital market. The biggest capital market with the UK is about to leave. So Europe should work at open global capital markets, being attractive to global capital. It's doing the opposite at the moment. So I think Europe, the direction of travel needs to be, Europe needs to be a global player. And for Europe to be a global player, it should overlook some of the internal dimension that is currently dominating in politics, and it should really do what do we have to do to attract global capital from the US and from Asia, and that's not what they're doing. They're trying to redistribute the bit of capital that is there within Europe rather than attract global capital. That's not how Europe will grow.
Stephanie, might an advantage or a benefit of Brexit, whether it happens or not, I don't know, be that you can spend more time focused on Manchester and Leeds and less focused on Brussels, to your point?
And that's often been the sell that Boris Johnson and others have made, and it would be a great, I think it's going to be a necessity coming out of, if we ever get out of this process or get into the next stage of the very long process. But the worry is the kind of economic costs that you're looking at, the potential reduction in productivity growth, inward investment, loss of jobs already in the UK that were based on a model of selling onto the European, into the single market. I worry that whatever you do to try and help these areas is going to be swamped by that. And certainly all of the economic analysis shows, even with the kind of deal that we might be looking at, enormous hit to the manufacturing sector just on over time, where the likes of Nissan, the Sunderland plant in Nissan produces more cars than all of Italy every year. That one plant, and it was the sort of you talked about Margaret Thatcher in your remarks last night, Tim. It was her sort of crowning achievement was to attract that investment. There is a lot of mutterings. They're already not going to build the next model that Nissan's planning, and they're already reducing their investment, reducing jobs there. So yes, you do. They should have just done it anyway without Brexit, and that's obviously the heartbreak.
So Glenn, go ahead.
Yeah, that's the key point. I think your question almost got it backwards. If we had focused more on those local concerns, the support for whether it's Brexit in Europe or a more global position for the US would have been there. So I think it's not an either or, but right now we don't have that local focus.
So how do we do that now? We're spending running $1 trillion deficits. Maybe you can tell me, does that matter anymore? Do deficits matter? We're at the top of the cycle. And if we just reallocate that in the right way, will that help solve the problem?
Well, I think actually the expenditure needed to address some of these problems is modest, at least by the standards of the Green New Deal or Medicare for All or all the other big things thrown out there. You could, for roughly $50 billion a year, get at a lot of the local infrastructure, community college, earned income tax credit expansions. And we're not talking about large amounts of money, and one could raise taxes modestly on the well-to-do to pay for that. One could trim the sales of the entitlement programs to do that. But I don't think we can continue to just add program after program. I do think deficits matter, not because I think they're overly consequential for interest rates in a global capital market, but they're future tax burdens. And they do matter in constraining growth. And unfortunately, on neither side of the aisle at the moment is there much of a discussion.
But Glenn, there is a point that when we think about these projects, we always think public capital. There's so much private capital sitting idle on the sideline that would fund these projects. So I think you can even get the same for much
for sure.
lower.
Well, on infrastructure, for example, if the public sector took the riskiest, think of it like the equity tranche, there is certainly safe money on top of that. In community colleges, as I said earlier, local businesses have a direct economic interest in talent development, so not all of this has to be public money. That's why I'm among the many reasons I dislike the left's policies are the grandiosity of these very large expenditures.
But Axel, why does that not happen in Germany? I mean, if you look at a map of Germany at the moment, the 4G coverage, I think a lot of people in this room would be surprised how patchy the coverage is for a country the size and the wealth
I can
of Germany.
attest to that.
Why does you have to basically stay on the train. You can't go even a few feet away from the train, the main train lines. But what is it that's stopping? I mean, we know, as you say, there is a mountain of liquidity, of cash ready for investment sitting in particularly German companies. Why has it not gone in?
Well, look, so I don't want this to become a Germany debate because we drill down too much into
We've already had the UK
weeds.
debate.
Okay, but I think in general, the misperception you have at the moment is that Germany would have a fiscal expansionary program to benefit Europe. That's not going to happen. They're going to have a fiscal program to benefit Germany. And if you look at where Germany is now, of course, it's absolutely not ideal to have a surplus of almost 3% and to go into a recession with that. It's not ideal to go with a balanced budget. They have a fiscal swing they could engineer of a couple of percentage points of GDP. Being in Germany, they will use that for a transformative investment. So take, for example, one thing that was very, very useful in the last financial crisis because it hit the auto industry. They were short hours worked and the car industry demand slumped completely. They put a scrapping premium in for old cars. There's nothing better than a scrapping premium for high pollution cars that sit out there. We have this diesel debate in Germany. The best thing you can do is facilitate a transformation of the economy towards a green economy by using these resources now. The same for 5G, the same for sort of fast-speed internet across the country, the same for many, many other areas. Unfortunately, Germany has sort of had the luxury of a relatively sort of good-run economy, very competitive at the global level, was with products of the last round. And they've missed the electrification of the car industry. They missed some of these trends. What I'm seeing now is people have woken up. I mean, once these large car companies put all their engineering might towards the electrification or the hybrid cars, they're going to be big innovators in that industry. So I wouldn't say that the race is already called on that. I think they've woken up and they're starting to see that we have a lot of catch-up to play, and they will do that. So I'm not that pessimistic that the core of European industrial heartland has lost this battle forever. They've just fallen behind. And maybe a very competitive situation with a favorable euro has helped German companies to be maybe a bit more in this rose garden longer than they should have been, but they've definitely woken up.
Let me ask the question, and not about Germany, but about just global capital flows. 16 trillion sitting in negative yielding assets, interest rates very low. But the developing world offers great, enormous returns, young population, rising productivity. Why don't we see more capital flows out of bunds and into emerging markets?
Well, I think you saw a lot of that in the first decade of the century, but you're not seeing as much now. I think there were three things which helped there. One, the export-led growth idea still made sense then. The commodity boom gave many governments massive revenues. And there's a broad sense that I think macro stability was important. So they could manage all this without the periodic booms and busts that they faced. I think all three are questioned now. First, export-led growth because of all the political pressures of exporting via China. The commodity boom, again, for similar reasons, is not strong at all. So they have more tightened fiscal situations. And I think the kind of aura around macro stability has broken down in a number of countries. The willingness to go the extra mile to keep inflation low, to keep your budgets under control, less clear. And there's sometimes a sense that, okay, if the governments wanted, if the markets wanted, we'll give them what they want, but we don't really have our hearts in it. And so I think given all this, I think there's a lot more suspicion about these countries. And, with the worry that Fed tightening could pull the money out at some point, not in the foreseeable future, but at some point, I think we're not seeing the flows to the extent that they should happen. And we're also not seeing the appropriate utilization to the extent it should happen. So both sides need to work on it.
But that's something, if I may I think you started the discussion on the right point. We've seen a policy-induced massive increase in uncertainty. around any payoff of any investment, and this has produced an investor strike at the same point in time when investments are probably the cheapest to fund that they've ever been. So there's massive capital sitting on the sidelines, but it's not happening because the uncertainties around trade war, about sort of your global supply chain and how you need to rejig is overpowering that decision. And unfortunately, it comes at the absolutely wrong time.
I mean, just on that last point, that the bans on certain companies, to my mind, are perhaps even more dangerous than the tariff war, because now you have no idea which part of your supply chain suddenly becomes, goes up in smoke. And so that compounds the uncertainty many times, because there are no rules on who you cannot ban.
Many companies I now talk to would ask a simple question. If this trade dispute with China and the US were to escalate and we were to choose, where would be our sunk cost of getting out of one or the other constituency? At that point in time, when you create such huge uncertainty, you basically bring everything to a halt. And I think the dynamic effects of the current investment strike that we're seeing are going to hit the economies a lot more down the road than we expect.
And I think it's just so interesting when you've had years of, one of the challenges of getting politicians to do the right thing in terms of long-term supply-side policies was that they wouldn't be around to see the benefits necessarily. That we knew that, productivity growth, you can't double it in a few years. You had to just, chip away at the supply side. The extraordinary thing is we're seeing the asymmetry on the other side, that it takes all that time to improve the supply side, but actually you can start destroying capacity and certainly put it and hurt.
Actually, Congress can take a lot of this
almost
back. We have given the president, and we gave past presidents, significant power in trade because we thought it would move the process further. Congress can take that power back, and this may be the only way out.
And Axel, to your point, what would cause the investor strike to stop? What would end the strike? What would we have to see? Give me an optimistic scenario.
Well, hard to do because, look, I mean, at the moment we're talking trade. That's the small picture. If you add technology, it's really about the competition on what technology will drive the internet and consumer choices. And whilst China has a number of companies in the top 10 and the US has, Europe is nowhere. I found it bizarre when I was reading about a week ago that the US administration is thinking about ways to help fund European tech companies to basically increase their productivity again, which I found that's a core European task. The Europeans should be all over that place. So I think the bigger issue is trade is only, I would say, a sideshow because that reflects the past. The issue about technology and enabling technology and whether, like the bans for single companies like Huawei, whether that will continue or not, is really leading you down a completely different trajectory into the future. And where we are now, the trade is kind of a mirror image on how do we deal with the past. The technology is how do we win the future. And that's more controversial.
And by the way, having Congress in charge of trade wouldn't necessarily produce a different outcome at this point.
At this point, that's true.
Absolutely. Yeah. And on all of these three issues, even on trade, I would say on the trade, the big trade dispute picture between the US and China, probably, there's a cross-party consensus that this needs to be addressed now. And on technologies, there's even more cross-party consensus that this is something we need to sort out now at a point in time where China technology is developing very, very fast.
And if the UK detethers from Europe and has to choose between the US and China, what does UK choose?
You're not even included. So we've already we've blown it with Europe. So now we get the choice of. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, Axel's right. This is a conversation and a question I ask many people in Europe. And by and large, it's interesting that that the assumption is Europe would have to choose the US, but with the likes of Huawei completely integrated into some of the fundamentally transformative technologies that we're seeing globally. Yeah. I agree with Axel. It's deeply consequential.
But the outcome is likely, Stephanie, the outcome is likely to be topic dependent. Because you take the whole issue about the carbon transformation and the environmental issues. There, I think Europe and China have more of a common denominator at the moment than they have with the United States. Take technology in general. I think Europe is nowhere. So at the moment, Europe has a choice to be dependent on US technology or Chinese technology. And in different areas, they've become dependent on one or the other. And the hard choice is to take a consistent choice, which they will not do anytime soon. The only reasonable choice is develop your own. But that will take decades.
I think the only thing I would say is where the Europeans could end up taking the lead is the other major change that we probably will have coming down the track and affecting businesses faster than we think. And we'll be talking about it more this time in a year, is decarbonisation.
Sure.
And I think the fact that Greens are now mainstream in the European Parliament, and there's this heightened political awareness of the need to come up with a framework for decarbonisation, is actually an area where the EU institutions could work quite well, and then allow Europe to take the lead in some of these things. So I think and you talked about electric cars, but I think that is one of the areas where Europe has an interesting amount of potential right now.
I don't
a
think
big denominator.
to your question, Tim, I don't think there is an optimistic structural answer. And cyclically, you could imagine a US-China trade truce or something like that being good. But there's a fundamental competition. China is fundamentally different. It is not part of the economic order the US tried to build. It is not part of the assumptions that were built into its succession of the WTO. And that's not going to change very much.
But we can peacefully coexist. You would
right,
give me
but
that.
what that does mean in areas like technology platforms and things, we may not have the same kind of homogeneity objective that we might have had in a fully globalized world. I just don't see an optimistic solution there.
Do you have some optimism? You're an optimist. We had 2 minutes to go. Give me some optimism.
Well, if we had statesmanship, we could. Let me put it this way. I think we are going on a path with China and the United States where conflict seems inevitable. And I don't think it needs to be that. You don't have to be completely naive either. But there are ways that you can accommodate both powers in the global system without necessarily it being it's splitting into two with a full-fledged Cold War. And the question is, what changes do we need to make in the system to make that possible? Because that's the only way we will sustain globalization. I think the way we're going right now, it's almost inevitable we will have conflict, not just trade or economic conflict, but perhaps conflict of the other kind. On the other hand, if we recognize that first China is not immutable, it can change.
Right,
and if the Chinese leadership changes, there could be a significant also change in their attitudes. But you're not going to bring them to the table by pushing them away. You've got to give them incentives to come to the table and think about what the new order looks like.
Right, and not pushing them away, and you can't humiliate them.
And
it is not a zero sum.
And actually, in trade and economic relationships, proximity matters. So if we're forcing out of a 7 billion global population to take a choice between China and the US, more than half of the world population located throughout Asia will take a choice that is pro-China and pro the region. And that's where we shouldn't go. That's where I think Glenn's absolutely right. It doesn't have to be either or. It has to be a coexistence. It has to be finding a way to have both play a role in the global economy. Otherwise, we're going down, as I said before, the wrong path. Europe might have to choose. I mean, I'm a born transatlantic, so for us, the US was always the first choice in terms of proximity. That is changing for many Europeans of different generations. They've not grown up in this transatlantic order that has worked and delivered for them. They're growing up in a transatlantic order that they see as a conflict order. And they are looking into what will my future in this global economy be, and they're looking at China as a source of growth. And I think we really need to address the issue with the institutions we have. Can we bring everyone back to the table? Because I don't think it needs another world war or another really deep recession or problem to recognize that we're in this together. We're creating, and I talked to some investors, you need to almost create a one planet fund and a one planet strategy in order to get on top of the global challenges we have. Carbon is a global challenge. Anybody that thinks we can have a local solution or a fragmented solution with everyone not being at the same table, you're completely lost. And so I think we need to look at this, that the next challenges are global. We created them to be global because of globalization. Now we need to resolve them at the global level. Going back to the past is not going to be a good way to the future.
That's a great place to end, especially because you're the chairman of my board, and I'm going to end with you. This has been, if I could stay here all day. Ladies and gentlemen, please give them a round of applause.